The judge signed the papers at 9:47 in the morning. By 9:52, my wife was already at the microphone. Celeste Voss, C. EO Public Face of North Star Medical Logistics. And as of 7 minutes ago, my ex-wife stood on the courthouse steps and told 30 cameras that I had been fired from the company I founded. Then she introduced Preston, her cousin, as my replacement. She smiled the whole time. She had clearly been planning this moment far longer than she had been planning the divorce. Everyone waited for me to react, to fight back, to cry, to say something desperate into the nearest microphone. Instead, I looked at Raina, my assistant of 9 years, briefcase in hand, and said the 5 words that would unravel everything Celeste thought she had already won. Fire every one of them. If you've ever watched someone try to erase everything you built, stay with me. Because what happened next took 18 years to set up and about 2 hours to finish. Subscribe if you're new here. You're going to want to hear how this ends. I built North Star Medical Logistics, the way most things worth keeping get built. Not with a grand plan, but with a problem I couldn't stop thinking about. 18 years ago, I was a maintenance technician at a public hospital in Milwaukee, the kind of guy nobody noticed until a machine stopped working. I fixed ventilators, calibrated infusion pumps, and kept equipment running that doctors relied on without ever really thinking about. I was fine with that. I didn't need to be noticed. I needed the machines to work. Then, one February, a blizzard shut down the highways north of the city, and a transport truck carrying a ventilator got stuck for 6 hours on an overpass. The patient it was meant for didn't make it. He was 23 years old. The equipment that could have saved him was sitting in a truck 3 miles away, perfectly functional, going nowhere. I remember standing in the break room when the news came through, and I remember the specific feeling of it, not grief exactly, but something colder. The equipment existed. The will to send it existed. The system connecting those two things had simply failed. That failure was fixable. I kept waiting for someone else to fix it. After 2 years of waiting, I stopped. I borrowed against my father's house in St. Paul, bought a used truck, hired 2 people I trusted, and started North Star Emergency Transport out of a red brick warehouse my father used to run as a machine repair shop. We called it Hale Works. Still do. I designed the thermal storage units myself, modified the suspension for winter road conditions, and drove the routes personally in the beginning, learning every highway, every back road, every shortcut between Minneapolis and Duluth that a GPS wouldn't know to suggest. The first year, we lost money. The second year, we broke even. By the third year, 2 hospital systems had signed contracts with us, and I was starting to believe this thing was real. That was when I met Celeste. She came in through a mutual contact, someone who said she was looking to consult for companies with a social mission and real growth potential. She walked into Hale Works wearing a coat that cost more than my truck payment, looked around the warehouse without flinching, and asked me in the first 10 minutes what my biggest operational bottleneck was. Not what my mission was. Not what inspired me. The bottleneck. I answered honestly, and she listened without interrupting, which at the time felt like a rare and underrated quality in a person. By the end of that first meeting, she had sketched out a communication strategy on a legal pad that addressed 3 problems I hadn't been able to articulate clearly even to myself. I want to be honest about this part because it matters to what came later. In those early years, Celeste was extraordinary. She wasn't performing a role, she was genuinely in it with me. There was a night in our second year of working together, maybe 3 months before we started dating, when we got caught in a storm on the way back from a delivery run in Duluth. The GPS lost signal somewhere outside of Moose Lake, and we pulled off the highway and sat in the cab of the truck at 2 in the morning with a paper road atlas spread across the dashboard. The heat was barely working. She was supposed to have a presentation the next morning for a potential hospital partner, and instead she was tracing county roads with her finger under a flashlight, and she was laughing. Not performing calm, actually laughing because the situation was absurd and she knew it and she didn't need it to be anything else. That was the woman I fell in love with. I want to be clear that she was real, because what happened later only makes sense if you understand that she was. We got married 4 years after we met. We renamed the company North Star Medical Logistics, expanded the fleet, opened warehouse hubs across the Midwest, and signed contracts with regional hospital networks and federal emergency response agencies. When our daughter Amara was born, I made a deliberate choice to step back from public-facing work. I wanted to be present at home in a way my own father hadn't always managed to be, and I trusted Celeste to carry the external side of things. She became CEO. She became the face of North Star, the one giving keynote addresses, doing television interviews, shaking hands at industry conferences. I stayed in the background, managing operations, refining systems, working with the teams that actually moved equipment across frozen highways at 3 in the morning. I told myself this was a division of labor, not a division of ownership. That distinction turned out to matter more than I had realized. I still held 57% of the voting shares through a structure called the Hale Strategic Trust, something my attorney had insisted on when we incorporated a detail that Celeste knew about but rarely discussed. She was the CEO. I was the chairman. On paper, those two things were clearly different. In practice, as the years passed and Celeste's public profile grew, the gap between how the company was perceived and how it was actually structured became its own kind of problem. Journalists wrote about Celeste Voss and North Star as though the two were synonymous. Industry profiles described her as the founder. My name appeared in the early history sections of press materials, past tense archived, the kind of credit that gets mentioned once and then quietly removed from subsequent drafts. I noticed. I didn't say anything about it because I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit as long as the equipment kept moving. That was either humility or naivety, and I still haven't decided which. The first sign that something was genuinely wrong came about 14 months before the divorce, when Celeste's mother Vivian suggested that her nephew Preston Vale join the company as Vice President of Strategy and Procurement. Vivian Voss was 64, a retired corporate image consultant who spoke softly and always seemed to be offering help that nobody had asked for. She framed Preston's addition as an opportunity. He had an MBA from a respected program connections in markets. North Star hadn't penetrated ideas about international expansion. Celeste was enthusiastic in a way that felt slightly too prepared, like she had already decided before the conversation started. I agreed, partly because I had no specific objection, and partly because I trusted that Celeste still wanted what I wanted. That trust was the most expensive mistake I ever made. Within 3 months of Preston's arrival, the procurement numbers stopped making sense. A consulting firm called Polar Meridian started receiving large payments for something described in the contracts as Transport Corridor Optimization Services. No deliverables were ever submitted. A new equipment supplier began billing North Star for thermal storage units at rates significantly above what we had previously paid, and the units themselves were measurably lower quality than what our teams had been using. Those were problems I could quantify. The problem I couldn't initially quantify was more troubling. Our logistics system was recording deliveries to rural clinics in northern Minnesota and Wisconsin, deliveries that when I started calling the receiving facilities directly, nobody could confirm had ever arrived. Shipments that existed only on invoices. When I brought this to Preston directly, he responded with the particular fluency of someone who has learned to speak in a way that communicates nothing. He used phrases like adaptive market costs and intermediary distribution partnerships with the confidence of a man who knows his audience won't push back. When I pushed back, Celeste stepped in and said I was micromanaging, that I needed to trust the leadership team she had assembled, that my involvement in day-to-day procurement was creating friction. It was the first time in 16 years of marriage and business that she had spoken to me like I was an obstacle rather than a partner. I sat with that for a long time before I understood what it meant. I called Raina into my office on a Tuesday evening after the rest of the floor had cleared out. Raina Cole had been my executive assistant for 9 years, and if you want to understand what that actually means, it means she knew the operational structure of North Star better than most of the people who held titles above her. She knew which contracts were solid and which were performative. She knew which relationships were real and which were maintained for appearances. She was the kind of person who absorbed information without being asked to, and kept it without being told to, and I had come to rely on that quality in a way I had never fully articulated to her. I asked her to quietly pull everything she could find: contracts, shipping manifests, GPS logs from the fleet, internal emails related to procurement decisions made in the last 18 months, and to store copies somewhere outside the company's main server system. She asked me one question before she started. "How long do you think this has been going on?" I looked out the window at the Mississippi frozen over in the January dark and gave her the only honest answer I had. Long enough that they stopped worrying about anyone checking. What Raina found over the following 3 weeks was worse than what I had suspected. Buried in a deleted folder on the executive server recovered through a third-party data retrieval service was a document labeled Project Aurora. It was a detailed plan authored over several months to sell 48% of Northstar to an acquisition fund called Helix Dominion Capital. Helix Dominion specialized in purchasing family-built companies, restructuring them by cutting staff and operational overhead, and liquidating assets in segments. The document was specific about sequencing the sale could not proceed while I retained board authority. My removal had to come first. I read through the email chain attached to the file. Most of it was clinical timelines, legal strategies, talking points for the board presentation. But near the beginning of the chain, before the plan had fully solidified, there was an email from Celeste to her mother that stopped me. She had written, "Mom, I'm not sure I can do this to Des." Vivian's reply came 11 minutes later and ran nearly 2 pages. The last line read, "My daughter was not made to spend her life in a machine shop." Celeste never responded to that email, but she didn't leave the project either. I've thought about that a lot, that moment when she could have walked away and didn't. I'm not sure whether it makes what came next more forgivable or less. The final discovery was Hale Works, the warehouse in St. Paul. My father's building, the place where I had assembled the first Northstar vehicle with my own hands, where the pencil marks measuring my childhood height were still on the door frame next to Amara's handprints from when she was 6, had been listed as collateral on a loan I had never authorized. A digital copy of my signature was attached to the documents. If the Helix Dominion deal fell through, or the loan was called Hale Works, would transfer to the fund automatically. They had found a way to take the one thing I had never considered putting on the table. I could have confronted Celeste that night. Part of me wanted to, but I had spent 18 years building systems, and I understood something about timing, that anger tends to obscure the moment you show your hand before you're ready, is the moment you lose every advantage the other side doesn't know you have. If I walked into that conversation without complete documentation, she would move the servers, revise the records, and use Amara as leverage to keep me quiet. So I did what I had always done when the problem in front of me felt too large to approach directly. I started from the beginning. I called the attorney who had structured the Hale Strategic Trust, a man Celeste believed had retired because he had stopped returning her calls 2 years earlier, and she had assumed that meant he was gone. I asked him to review the trust documents in full and tell me exactly what authority remained in my hands. And then I waited the way you wait when you know that the most dangerous move you can make is the one that gives away how much you already know. The war had already started. Celeste just didn't know yet that I was in it. The first thing Celeste took was the calendar. Not dramatically, there was no announcement, no confrontation. I simply stopped receiving notifications for board meetings. The first time it happened, I assumed it was a system error. The second time, I drove to the office and found the conference room already occupied, the agenda already underway, Preston sitting in the chair closest to the head of the table. He looked up when I walked in with the particular expression of someone who has been told to expect you but was hoping you wouldn't show. Celeste said calmly and in front of everyone that the schedule had been updated and that she had asked Raina to inform me. Raina had received no such instruction. I know because I asked her the moment I stepped back into the hallway, and Raina's answer came in the same careful, factual tone she always used when she was telling me something she knew I wouldn't want to hear. That was how it worked. Not loudly. Piece by piece, quietly enough that each individual thing could be explained away, but steadily enough that within 6 weeks, I had lost access to 2 floors of the building. My financial reports arrived with sections redacted for reasons nobody could specify, and 3 department heads I had worked with for years had been either reassigned or quietly pressured into resigning. Preston filled those positions with people I didn't recognize. People who answered to Vivian's network before they answered to the company's mission. The machinery of North Star was being rewired from the inside, and it was being done with enough patience that anyone watching from the outside would have seen nothing but ordinary organizational change. What I couldn't protect against was what Celeste was doing away from the office. She was building a story. She told it to friends, to colleagues, to people in our social circle who would eventually repeat it to enough other people that it would take on the quality of common knowledge. The story was that I was struggling, that the success of North Star had always been more than I could process, that I had become controlling and paranoid, that I couldn't accept the reality of my wife's accomplishments outpacing my own. She said it gently with the kind of measured concern that makes people feel they're hearing a confidence rather than a campaign. By the time the divorce filing became public, the narrative was already in place. Desmond Hale was a man who had been left behind, and everything that followed was just the fallout of that. The hardest version of that story to hear was the one she told Amara. I don't know exactly what Celeste said to our daughter. I only know the result of it. Amara was 13, old enough to understand the broad shape of what was happening between her parents, but too young to have any reliable way to evaluate competing accounts of it. Celeste told her that I was trying to undermine the company, that I resented her mother's success, that the things I was doing were motivated by ego rather than any legitimate concern. And because I had made the decision not to share what I actually knew, because the evidence was still being assembled, because I understood that one premature conversation could compromise everything, Amara had no counterweight to what she was being told. My silence read as guilt to a 13-year-old who was already trying to make sense of a world that was fracturing around her. I want to be precise about what that cost me. I've lost business deals. I've driven through whiteout conditions with a truck full of equipment and genuinely not been sure I'd make it. I've sat across from hospital administrators and been told our bids weren't competitive, then gone back and rebuilt the proposal from scratch. None of that prepared me for the specific experience of watching my daughter look at me with the particular expression that means she has already decided who is telling the truth, and it isn't you. I couldn't give her the documents. I couldn't hand a 13-year-old a folder full of financial records and email chains and say, "Here, this is what your mother did." Some lines you don't cross even when staying on the right side of them costs you something you can't afford to lose. Raina told me once during those weeks that I should consider giving Amara something, not the full story, but enough of a foundation that she wouldn't be building her understanding entirely on Celeste's version. I told her no. A child shouldn't have to carry evidence against her own mother. I said, and I meant it, and I still mean it, even knowing what it cost me in those months when Amara answered my calls with a flatness in her voice that hadn't been there before. The thing that changed the calculation entirely happened on a Thursday night in January, 7 weeks before the divorce was finalized. A small hospital outside Duluth put in an emergency request for an ECMO unit, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, the kind of equipment that keeps a patient alive when their heart and lungs can no longer do it on their own. The system logged the request as fulfilled. A truck had been dispatched according to the records. The hospital never received it. I found out because a logistics manager named Gary, someone I had hired in North Star's 3rd year, and who had been quietly reassigned to a satellite office after refusing to approve one of Preston's supplier contracts, called my personal cell phone at 11 at night and told me the hospital had called him directly because they had lost faith in the main dispatch line. I drove to the coordination center myself. What I found was that the order had been rerouted standard procedure, now apparently under Preston's procurement restructuring, to a subcontractor that existed on our approved vendor list, but had no refrigerated medical transport vehicles in operational condition anywhere within 300 miles of Duluth. The truck the system had assigned to the run was parked at a depot outside of Rochester, flagged for maintenance. Nobody had caught it. Nobody had been watching closely enough to catch it because the people whose job it had been to watch closely had been systematically replaced by people whose job was to not ask questions. I called in a team from our original fleet drivers who had been with North Star since the early years and who answered when I called regardless of what the org chart currently said. I took the backup vehicle myself and drove north through a storm that dropped visibility to near zero for most of the trip. We reached the hospital with the unit at 4:20 in the morning. The attending physician told me afterward that another 40 minutes would likely have been too late. I stood in the parking lot in the dark and the snow, and understood something that I had been circling for weeks without letting myself land on directly. This was no longer about me. It had stopped being about me the moment Preston's network started treating medical equipment like a line item to be arbitraged. People were going to die if this continued. That wasn't a rhetorical point. That was a 40-minute margin in a hospital outside Duluth on a Thursday night in January. When I got back to Minneapolis, Raina and I spent the next 4 days doing something I should have done months earlier. We cross-referenced every GPS log from the fleet against every delivery record in the system, matched them against fuel receipts and hospital receiving confirmations, and built a complete picture of what Preston's procurement operation had actually produced. 31 deliveries in 14 months were fraudulent logged as completed billed in full never made. The money from those transactions had moved through a series of intermediary accounts before landing in companies that, when you traced the incorporation documents far enough, connected back to Vivian and to members of her professional network from her years as a consultant. My attorney, meanwhile, had finished his review of the Hale Strategic Trust. The news was better than I had allowed myself to hope. As chairman and controlling shareholder, I retained the authority to suspend any executive, including the CEO, if I could demonstrate evidence of fraud, document falsification, or actions that endangered North Star's medical operations. Critically, that authority required formal board documentation to be legally unassailable, meaning I needed the board on record, not just my own unilateral word. I had evidence of all 3 violations. Celeste had the title. I had the mechanism, and I now understood exactly how to use it. None of that was public knowledge, and Celeste, sensing that I was getting closer to something she couldn't contain, decided to move first. She filed the final divorce papers on a Thursday. By Monday, she had scheduled what her communications team was calling a press availability outside the Hennepin County Courthouse for the morning the judgment would be entered. She framed it internally as a chance to address the transition publicly and with clarity. What it actually was, I understood the moment I saw the guest list. Preston would be there along with 2 members of Vivian's network, who now held board-adjacent advisory roles, and a PR firm that Celeste had retained 3 months earlier, using a discretionary budget line I hadn't been informed about. I stood on those courthouse steps and let it happen. I had no umbrella. The snow came down steadily, the kind of fine, dry January snow that accumulates without announcing itself. And I stood in it and listened to my ex-wife tell 30 cameras that I had been terminated from North Star Medical Logistics, that the company needed leadership capable of moving into the future, that she wished me well personally, while making entirely clear that my professional chapter there was closed. Then Preston stepped up beside her, and she introduced him as the new chief operating officer with the kind of practiced warmth that only exists when someone has rehearsed a moment until it no longer feels rehearsed. The cameras found me immediately. That was the part she had been waiting for my reaction broadcast live, whatever grief or rage or desperation she expected to see on my face as the full weight of the morning landed on me. I gave the cameras nothing. I had been building something for 18 years in conditions most people would have walked away from, and I had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you can do in a difficult moment is let the other side decide when and how you respond. I turned to Raina. She was standing a few feet away from me, the leather briefcase in both hands, watching me with the steady attention of someone who already knew what was coming. I said it quietly, quiet enough that it was meant for her, though, as it turned out, a microphone on a nearby camera rig caught every word. "Fire every one of them." Celeste heard it. I saw the brief flicker of something cross her face before the smile returned. Not concern, not quite, but the instinctive recalibration of someone processing an unexpected variable. Then she decided it didn't matter. She turned back to the cameras and made a remark about how the difficulty of change could affect people in unpredictable ways. There was laughter. The moment was absorbed into the narrative she had already built, filed under further evidence of a man unraveling. She didn't know what was in the briefcase. She didn't know about the trust documents, the GPS logs, the 31 false deliveries, the email chain from Project Aurora, the attorney who had spent 3 weeks reconstructing the legal architecture of a company she thought she already owned. She heard 5 words and concluded that I had just handed her the last piece of the story she needed. That evening I drove to pick up Amara, according to the temporary custody arrangement the court had approved. I stood at the front door of the house we had shared for 11 years and knocked and waited and knocked again. After a long time, Amara's voice came through the door. Not the door opening, just her voice, thin and careful in the way it had become in recent months. She asked me why I wanted to fire her mother. She asked why I couldn't just let her mother be successful. I told her there were things I couldn't explain yet, not completely, but that she should know I hadn't done anything to be ashamed of. She said, and I've thought about this sentence every day since, maybe Mom is right. Maybe you just can't handle not being needed anymore. The door didn't open. I stood there for a while after her footsteps retreated down the hallway. The snow kept falling, indifferent to all of it. Later that night, Raina called and told me that Celeste had authorized the IT team to wipe my system access entirely, and that she had contracted an outside data center to receive a transfer of Northstar's primary servers. A transfer that, if completed, would move the records I hadn't yet copied beyond my legal reach. She also told me that Preston had sent a truck to Hale Works to begin removing equipment in preparation for the property handover to Helix Dominion. If I didn't move by 8 o'clock the next morning, the evidence would be gone and the building would no longer be mine. I drove to Hale Works. I sat down at my father's workbench in the cold and the dark, looked at the pencil marks on the doorframe, looked at Amara's handprints pressed into the wood beside them. I sat there for a long time. I won't pretend I wasn't close to letting all of it go the company, the fight, the whole exhausting project of trying to prove something to people who had already decided what they believed. There was a version of that night where I just sat in that building and let it be taken. Raina arrived around midnight. She set the briefcase on the workbench without being asked and stood across from me in the half-light. She said, "If you stop now, they'll tell this story forever. But the worst thing is what they'll keep doing to patients who never knew they were part of it." I looked at the briefcase. I looked at my father's tools hanging on the wall where he had left them. Then I stood up, picked up my phone, and sent a single message to every voting board member invoking my authority under the Hale Strategic Trust to convene an emergency session at 8 o'clock the following morning. The meeting was mandatory. Attendance was not optional. And for the first time in months, neither was I. I arrived at the North Star building at 7:45 the next morning. The lobby security guard, a man named Dennis, who had worked the morning shift for 6 years and knew me by name long before he knew Celeste's, looked up from his desk when I walked in and nodded once without being asked. He had received the trust documentation the night before, along with every other person whose cooperation I would need in the next hour. I took the elevator to the 29th floor, walked past the assistant stations that were just beginning to fill with people arriving for the day, and pushed open the door to the main conference room. Raina was already there. She had arranged 5 document folders along the center of the table with the kind of quiet precision that made you understand why I had trusted her for 9 years. 2 representatives from the hospital network were seated along the right wall. One of them was the attending physician from Duluth who had driven down that morning at my request. My attorney sat at the far end of the table next to the federal compliance officer I had contacted 3 days earlier. The board members arrived in the minutes that followed, most of them looking uncertain in the way people look when they've been told something significant is happening, but haven't been told what. Celeste walked in at 8 o'clock exactly with Preston behind her, and Vivian a step behind him. She was dressed for a signing ceremony, the kind of careful, authoritative presentation she had mastered over years of public appearances. She scanned the room, registered the faces she didn't recognize, and turned to me with the particular composure of someone who has decided in advance that whatever is happening can be managed. She told the security officer standing near the door to escort me out. Her voice was even almost bored, as if removing me from a room I had called into session were a routine administrative matter. Nobody moved. The head of building security, who reported directly to the board rather than to the executive team, told her that he had received a legal determination confirming my standing as controlling shareholder and chairman, and that the meeting had been properly convened under the authority of the Hale Strategic Trust. Celeste looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down. I stood at the head of the table and nodded to Raina, who began placing folders in front of each board member without commentary. The room watched her work. When every folder was distributed, I started talking. The first folder contained the delivery records, 31 shipments logged as completed cross-referenced against GPS data from the fleet fuel receipts, and written confirmation from the receiving facilities that the equipment had never arrived. The second contained the financial trail payments to Polar Meridian and 4 other shell entities traced through intermediary accounts to companies incorporated under names connected to Vivian's consulting network. The third was Preston's procurement contracts, each one signed by him personally, each one directing business to vendors who either didn't exist in any meaningful operational sense or who had been selected without any of the qualification review that Northstar's own safety protocols required. The fourth was Project Aurora, the full document including the timeline for my removal, the terms of the proposed sale to Helix Dominion, and the email chain in which the divorce had been discussed as a legal and strategic precondition to the transaction. The fifth was the Haleworks loan documentation with the forged signature clearly visible alongside a certified copy of my actual signature for comparison. Preston said the records were being misrepresented, that there were explanations for the procurement decisions that the documents didn't capture. He used the word context 4 times in 3 minutes. Celeste said I was manufacturing a retaliation narrative because I couldn't accept the outcome of the divorce, that everything I was presenting was filtered through personal grievance rather than factual analysis. I didn't argue with either of them. I picked up the remote for the room's audio system and played 40 seconds of a recorded internal meeting. Preston's voice, clear and unhurried, explaining to a logistics coordinator that the rural clinics in the northern network lacked the administrative infrastructure to audit incoming shipments, which made them, in his words, low accountability distribution points. The room absorbed that in silence. Then the physician from Duluth spoke. He described the night the ECMO unit didn't arrive. He described the 40-minute margin. He described what 40 minutes means when a patient's heart and lungs have stopped functioning on their own. He said it without drama, the way doctors describe things factually, precisely with the specific weight of someone who has stood in rooms where the difference between outcomes is measured in minutes. After that, nobody in the room looked at Preston. I read the board my determination under the Hale Strategic Trust. While my controlling share gave me the authority to act, I had convened this session because decisions of this magnitude deserve to be on the official record, witnessed, documented, and beyond any future legal challenge. Preston's contract was terminated effective immediately. The procurement director, the CFO, and 3 other executives connected to the Shell Company network were suspended pending the federal investigation. Vivian was to be removed from the premises and barred from all Northstar facilities. The Helix Dominion transaction was voided, and Celeste was removed as CEO on the grounds of breach of fiduciary duty, concealment of fraud, and the use of falsified documents to encumber company assets without board authorization. The vote was called. Of the 7 voting board members present, 6 voted in favor. The 7th abstained. Nobody voted against. It was over in less than 2 hours. Celeste left the conference room before the formal adjournment. I found her in the hallway outside, not by plan, but because the hallway was the only way out, and we both knew it. The floor-to-ceiling windows along that corridor looked out over the Mississippi, still frozen the ice, a dull gray-white in the February morning light. We stood on opposite sides of that view for a moment without either of us initiating anything. She looked different from the woman who had stood at the courthouse microphone the morning before. Not diminished exactly. Celeste had never been someone who diminished easily but reoriented the way a person looks when the story they've been telling themselves has just been taken out of their hands. She asked me how long I had been planning it. I told her the truth. I wasn't planning it. You were. I was just keeping records. She looked out at the river. After a while, she said quietly and without looking at me, I should never have let her take me that far. She wasn't asking for a response. She wasn't performing remorse for an audience. It was the kind of thing you say when you've finally stopped arguing with yourself about something you already know. I understood that she meant Vivian. I understood also that understanding it now didn't undo 14 months of deliberate systematic dismantling of the company, of my reputation, of my relationship with my own daughter. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and I had stopped needing them to resolve into something simpler. I told her that what she'd said didn't erase what had happened, but that it was the reason I hadn't tried to destroy her publicly when I had the means to do it. She didn't answer that. We stood there another moment, and then I walked back toward the conference room because there was still work to do, and the work had always been the point. When I reached the lobby, I saw Vivian waiting near the entrance, her coat on her posture as composed as ever. She was speaking to Celeste in a low, urgent voice, something about appeals, about remaining legal options, about the fact that this wasn't finished. Celeste listened for a moment. Then she picked up her bag, walked past her mother, and pushed through the revolving door without looking back. It was the first time in my memory that Celeste had walked away from Vivian mid-sentence. The federal investigation moved quickly once the documentation was in the hands of the compliance office. Preston and two of the procurement executives were named in a financial fraud inquiry within the week. The shell company network, Polar Meridian, and its related entities was frozen pending a full forensic audit. I didn't take the CEO position. That was a deliberate choice. I had spent months watching what happens when one person accumulates too much unaccountable authority in an organization, and the lesson wasn't specific to Celeste, it was structural. North Star needed leadership that had no personal history with the company's wars. Someone whose loyalty was to the mission rather than to any version of the story about how the mission had been built. I brought in a woman named Dr. Patricia Holt, a medical logistics specialist who had spent 15 years running emergency supply networks for international health organizations. She asked better operational questions in her first week than most of the executives I'd worked with in the past 3 years, and she had no interest in credit, which I had come to understand was one of the most important qualities a person in that role could have. The employees Preston had pushed out were contacted individually, not by email, not through HR. I called each of them, personally explained what had happened, and asked whether they wanted to come back. Most of them did. Gary, the logistics manager who had called me from his reassigned satellite office the night of the Duluth emergency, returned to run the Northern Network operations. He cried on the phone when I called him, which he would probably prefer I not mention, but which I'm mentioning because it was the moment I understood most clearly what the last 14 months had actually cost not me, but the people who had built this thing alongside me and been discarded for being too careful about it. A fund was established using the money recovered from the shell company accounts, directed specifically toward rural clinics in the northern Midwest, that had been shortchanged or bypassed entirely by Preston's procurement operation. It wasn't a gesture. It was a correction. The damage those communities had absorbed needed to be repaid with the exact resources that had been taken from them. Raina was appointed Director of Integrity and Operations with a reporting line directly to the board that existed independently of the CEO. When I told her, she asked whether I was giving her the position because I trusted her or because I didn't trust anyone else. I told her the distinction didn't matter as much as she thought, but that the real answer was simpler than either option. I needed someone in that chair who understood why the company existed, and she was the only person I was certain still knew. I reached a custody agreement with Celeste that was straightforward and fair and contained one condition I held to regardless of how the rest of the negotiation went: Neither of us would use Amara to continue fighting the other's battles. Celeste agreed without argument. About 3 weeks after the board meeting, I took Amara to Hale Works on a Saturday afternoon. She had read parts of the investigation summary, enough of it to understand the shape of what had happened, even if not every detail. She was quiet on the drive, over the particular quiet of someone reorganizing information they had been given in the wrong order. When we pulled up to the building, she got out and stood in front of it for a moment, looking at the red brick and the old painted sign above the loading bay, trying to reconcile this place with whatever she had imagined when people talked about North Star as an abstraction. Inside, she found the pencil marks on the doorframe without me pointing to them. She ran her hand over the numbers and dates, then found her own handprints in the wood beside them, her 6-year-old handprints pressed there during an afternoon I remembered more clearly than most. She didn't say anything immediately, which was how Amara had always processed things that mattered to her. Then she told me she was sorry for what she had said at the door that night. She said it the way teenagers say the things that cost them the most, directly, without softening it, because she had decided to say it and she wasn't going to do it halfway. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. She had done what any reasonable person does when they're given one version of a story by someone they love and no credible alternative. She had believed it. That wasn't a failure. That was just being 13 in the middle of something she hadn't been given the tools to navigate. She asked me why I hadn't told her the truth earlier. I said, because the truth would have made you a judge between your parents, and that's not something a child should have to be. That's the job of grown-ups who should know better. She thought about that for a while. Then she asked if I hated her mother. I looked out through the warehouse's old industrial windows at the snow coming down over the river, fine and steady, and I told her the honest answer, that I was angry about what had been done, and that I probably would be for a while longer, but that I had no intention of spending the rest of my life feeding that anger. Hating Celeste would have required me to keep her at the center of everything I did, and she had already occupied that position for long enough. Letting go doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen, I told Amara. It means deciding it doesn't get to run the rest of your life. We walked to the far end of the warehouse where the first vehicle from the post-restructuring fleet was parked, and ready a new thermal transport unit built to the specifications I had originally designed 18 years ago, updated for current equipment requirements. Amara climbed up into the cab with me, and we started the engine together, which was something her grandfather had taught me to do the first time I ever sat in a truck, and which I had been waiting years to pass on to her. Along the side of the vehicle, in clean white letters against the dark blue panel, were the words we had decided on for the entire new fleet. No family name, no founder's credit, just the sentence that had been true since the beginning, and would remain true after every version of this story had been told and retold and finally set down. No life should be lost because help arrived too late. The truck pulled out of Hale Works and turned onto the road, heading north into the snow toward whatever hospital needed it first. Raina was standing in the loading bay doorway as we watched it go. She asked me after a moment whether I regretted waiting as long as I had before acting. I thought about the Duluth hospital. I thought about Gary's phone call at 11 at night. I thought about sitting at my father's workbench in the dark, close to letting everything go, and about what had gotten me off that bench and back to work. Moving faster might have let me win sooner, I said, but waiting until I had the truth meant I could protect the people who actually mattered. I've thought a lot about what this whole thing taught me, not just about business or marriage or legal structures, but about the kind of person you become when everything is taken from you at once. The easy version of this story is that I won. But I don't think that's quite right. I didn't win. I just refused to lose in the way they had planned for me. If there's anything I'd want someone to take from all of this, it's simple.